In Laboratory Reddit, today's story is
My fiancé abandoned their special daughter and ran away with his ex. My revenge when they returned with cancer destroyed them. I am 29 years old, and 2 years ago my ex-fiancé Scott, 30, left me in charge of his daughter with special needs, only to disappear with his ex-girlfriend Ellen a week after we got engaged. At the time, we had been together for 3 years and living in the same house for 6 months. He told me he was leaving for work and asked me to look after his daughter for a few days. I accepted, thinking that, as we were getting married, it was a good idea to learn to be alone with her. Besides, she was a quiet child and we got along very well. After 3 days without hearing from him, at first I thought he would be busy working. When almost a week went by without hearing from him, I started to get seriously worried. I tried to contact his family, but no one answered. Neither did his friends. I realized that they had all blocked me, and he had deactivated all his social networks and blocked me everywhere. When I called his work, they informed me that he had resigned a month ago and that they hadn't heard from him since. That's when I began to suspect that he might not come back. However, as his daughter was still with me, I kept hoping that he would return and we could work things out. A couple of days later, while searching desperately throughout the house for any clue as to his whereabouts, I found a note hidden under his side of the bed, stuck to the underside of the mattress. It was a letter addressed to me explaining that our relationship had been a mistake and that he had been cheating on me with Ellen during the 3 years we had been together. He confessed that he had gotten engaged to me thinking that it would help him stop seeing Ellen. However, when she found out, she proposed to him and they decided to run away together to start a new life somewhere else, asking me not to try to find them. In the letter, Scott expressed his regret, but he also stated that he was leaving his daughter because he considered her a useless burden. He wrote that it was too much for them and that they could no longer handle the situation. He left me the option of adopting her or doing whatever I thought was appropriate, as they had decided to live the life they had always wanted. Although the letter broke my heart, I didn't even have time to cry because I needed to act quickly. I contacted Child Protective Services because the child had clearly been abandoned and I didn't know what else to do. I didn't feel ready to adopt her on my own. If Scott had been present, it would have been different, but I couldn't take care of her on my own. Besides, the way they had left her made everything more difficult. Although I loved her very much, I knew I couldn't keep her under the circumstances. After contacting Child Protective Services, the paternal grandparents were forced to respond, although they made it clear that they were not prepared to assume that responsibility. Finally, the maternal grandparents, Ellen's parents, took her in and she has lived with them ever since. Once she was safe, attempts were made to locate her parents for a few months, but as it was not a priority case, they eventually stopped looking. It was clear that Scott and Ellen didn't want to be found and, even if they had been, the note made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with their daughter. About a year after she left, a court terminated their parental rights and Ellen's parents were appointed legal guardians. I keep in touch with them and I know that the girl is well looked after, which reassures me. Of course, dealing emotionally with Scott's abandonment was very difficult, but I had to move on somehow. It's been 2 years and although I've come to terms with it, I now have serious problems trusting people. I'm still living in the same house, and last week Scott and Ellen showed up at my door. I decided to open it because I really wanted to hear what they had to say after all this time. They began by apologizing through their tears, admitting that they had made a terrible mistake and saying that they now felt ready to be parents. They wanted their daughter back and were willing to compensate me financially for whatever amount I asked if I would help them. I don't know what came over me, but it infuriated me that they were naive enough to think they could fix everything with money. I told them it was too late, that I had handed their daughter over to social services 2 years ago and that I hadn't heard anything about her since. I told them that if they were looking for their daughter, they were knocking on the wrong door because as far as I was concerned, they no longer had a daughter. I closed the door, leaving them crying and begging me to talk to them, and then I informed Ellen's parents of her return. When I told my parents what had happened, they told me that my attitude had been wrong. They believe that there was no reason to lie to them like that despite what they did, and they think that I should tell them the truth and let them decide what to do. I don't agree, and we had a big argument, because precisely they, know everything that I went through, and yet they think that I shouldn't have acted like that. I think they are being unreasonable, and they think I am being cruel. They are right that I am being cruel, but I think they deserve it, and that's where we disagree. Addition, I realized that in my haste I forgot to mention several important details about Scott, Ellen, and their daughter. Scott and Ellen met at university and fell in love. She became pregnant at the age of 21, during her final year. He proposed to her, but Ellen's parents were against it. She had to fight hard to be able to keep the pregnancy, but her parents were still against the marriage because Scott wasn't taking his studies seriously and wasn't interested in working. Scott himself confessed to me that all this was true. At the time he wanted to be a musician, but he wasn't talented enough and wasn't prepared for that lifestyle. They stayed together until their daughter was 1, but Ellen began to get frustrated because Scott jumped from one job to another without achieving stability, and it was clear that his parents would never approve of him. So she left him. 2 years later he met me and we started going out, then we got engaged and he seemed to have forgotten about Ellen, keeping in touch only because of their daughter. That's why I never felt insecure. He hardly ever talked about her, so I thought he had completely moved on, but I was wrong, and that's why all this happened. As for her daughter's age, she turns 8 this year. When she was abandoned she was 6, and I had known her since she was 3. We had a special connection, that's why I kept in touch with her. After knowing her for 3 years, I couldn't just cut her out of my life because of something her parents did. That's why I chose to keep in touch. Update 1: A few days have passed since my publication and the situation with my parents remains the same. They maintain that my behavior was excessively cruel and unnecessary, but I consider that what Scott and Ellen did to their daughter and to me 2 years ago was much worse. If my parents cannot understand my point of view and continue to think that I am wrong, they can continue to think that I don't care. I have made my decision and what is done is done. Ellen's parents called me this morning to tell me that Ellen had contacted them by email, asking for forgiveness and asking if they could help her locate her daughter. Her parents have not responded and have no intention of doing so. Legally, they have no obligation to share information about the girl, now their adopted daughter, especially with the people who abandoned her. I find their nerve incredible, turning up after 2 years asking about their daughter and saying they are now ready to be parents. Ellen's parents and I remember perfectly how difficult it was to explain to a 6-year-old that her parents probably wouldn't be coming back. They have no idea how emotionally draining it was for the 3 of us to comfort her when she cried for her parents, not knowing how to explain the situation to her. Of course, we were planning to tell her everything when she was older, but given her condition, things are different with her. Everything is more complicated, and they never, not once, bothered to see how their own daughter was. She was only 6 years old, for God's sake. I can't understand how they could just abandon her and leave. And now, just because they feel guilty and it suits them, they want to be part of her life again. The nerve of them. I'm glad Ellen's parents never approved of Scott, and I think they were right about him. Those 2 really deserve each other, and anyone who thinks I should show them any kind of compassion is wrong. In fact, they should be grateful that the police didn't pursue the case as a low priority. If they had been found, I would have personally sued them. I didn't have the chance then, but now I will do everything I can to make them pay for their actions. And I don't mean money, but for them to suffer emotionally. No amount of money can compensate for what they did, especially to me. At least their daughter is young and in time she will be able to get over it and maybe forget it. It won't be easy for her, but she has her whole life ahead of her. I, on the other hand, had planned my whole future with Scott, and after him I haven't been able to trust any man. For the last year, I've been trying to start dating again, but it's not working. I've had a couple of dates, but they always end up nothing. My parents know how difficult it has been for me to get through all this, how hard it was for him to abandon me like that, and yet they think I'm being cruel to him. It doesn't make sense to me, and it hurts and angers me that they choose not to talk to me about something like this. I'm their only daughter, and I can't believe they would treat me this way. It's very disappointing, but there's nothing I can do about it, and I definitely won't be the one to make the first move. If they want to talk to me, they will have to approach me. In the meantime, I am grateful to have this platform to talk about my problems anonymously, because until now I haven't even been able to tell my friends any of this. It's too personal, and, after my parents' reaction, I don't know what to expect from anyone. I don't need any more drama in my life right now, so for now I will keep it to myself. Update 2. A few days have passed since my last update, and, as Ellen's parents did not reply to her email, she decided to show up at their house unannounced. She went alone, without Scott, and after her visit they called me to tell me what had happened. When Ellen arrived, they refused to let her in and told her that they didn't want anything to do with her, and that if she was looking for their daughter, she was only going to be disappointed because she wasn't with them. Luckily, the girl was asleep at the time, so there was no chance she would discover her in the house. Ellen began to plead and cry, insisting that she knew her daughter had to be there and that we were all lying to her. She said she knew she had made a mistake, but that, as a mother, she had the right to see her daughter. She demanded to be let in, saying that her parents couldn't be so cruel. They argued, and when they closed the door, Ellen started to hit her, but fortunately her daughter did not wake up. I think it would have been very traumatic for her. She finally left when her parents threatened to call the police. They called me to warn me because, now that they had somehow discovered that their daughter was with them, they would probably try to persuade me to intercede on their behalf, but obviously that is not going to happen. I am not even going to consider receiving them, and I will definitely call the police if they show up here again. I honestly believe that Scott's parents are responsible for this. Although they didn't participate much in the adoption process, they probably found out something when the Child Protection Services contacted them. They must have assumed that the girl is with Ellen's parents, since she is obviously not with me. And since they always adored Scott, I'm sure they kept in touch with him during these 2 years but refused to help locate them. I think all these people have failed as parents and as decent people in general. They deserve each other and they should leave us alone. I don't even understand why they insist on getting back together with their daughter. They could have another baby now, or maybe, and this is just a guess, part of the reason they want to get back together is that they have problems conceiving. I've heard stories like that, and it wouldn't surprise me, given how selfish and cruel their behavior was the first time around. I can't say for sure why they want to get back together with their daughter after 2 years, but from what I've noticed these days, I'm pretty sure it has nothing to do with their conscience. In fact, they probably don't even have a conscience, because if they did, they wouldn't have done something so horrible in the first place. This whole situation is starting to affect me a lot. There was hardly any mention of anything to do with Ellen or Scott, to the point that I almost forgot they were his parents. They never talked about her, but lately I feel like I'm drowning because I've been thinking about them every day again. It's as if all the healing and self-care of the last 2 years is unraveling, because I feel like I'm returning to the state of mind of the first few days after Scott left me. That can't happen because it was one of the darkest periods of my life and I don't want to go back there. At least then I had the support of my parents, but now they won't even talk to me. Time has passed and they still won't talk to me, and I don't know what it will take for them to recognize that maybe they weren't right. Maybe Scott and Ellen deserve the treatment they're getting now. I don't understand why they are so stubborn about this whole thing, but even I have decided that enough time has passed and a simple apology will no longer be enough. I don't know exactly what I want them to do, but going back and saying they're sorry won't be enough. They will have to show me that they are sorry, and I will decide whether or not I want to forgive them, because I think they have been very insensitive and I don't need any more of that in my life right now. Update 3. Just as Ellen's parents predicted, 2 days after she showed up at their house, Scott showed up at mine. I don't understand why these people think we're going to help them, especially after everything they put us through over the last 2 years. But for some reason, they think we owe them kindness even after being so cruel and insensitive to all of us. As I expected, he came alone this time, without Ellen, and I'm sure it's some kind of strategy. They probably think that turning up together would upset us more. They're trying to pretend they care about our feelings. I don't understand why they think we're so naive, but when he turned up, I told him to leave immediately or I'd call the police. She started crying, saying that she knew she had ruined it but that she had learned her lesson, and said that karma had finally caught up with them. Apparently, a few months ago Ellen had been diagnosed with cervical cancer and they believed this was their punishment for abandoning their daughter and treating us the way they did. They have returned to make up for everything they did and they hope we will forgive them so they can move on with their lives and get their daughter back. I don't know if the cancer story is true, but I don't care. I told him through the door that his story didn't move me and that if he thought he could arouse my compassion by saying these things, he was very wrong. I haven't forgotten how I felt when he left me and I will never forget that feeling because of the trust issues it has caused me. I feel no need to forgive him or to believe his stories. Even if the cancer story is true, I don't care because his daughter is not a toy they can get back whenever they want. They may have found out where she is and who she is with, but if he was here to convince me to talk to Ellen's parents and let them have her back, he was very wrong because I wasn't going to do any of that and my decision was final. I didn't want to hear anything else. I gave him 30 seconds to leave my property. I already had the phone in my hand to call the police when he told me he was leaving, but I needed him to know that I wasn't lying. He assured me that everything he had said was true and that he really regretted everything I had to go through, what Ellen's parents had to go through. He confirmed what I already knew, that his parents had told him that Ellen's parents had probably adopted their daughter. He also told me that Ellen had already visited them but had not managed to see her daughter even once, so they thought that at least I would have some sympathy for them knowing his condition and would arrange a meeting between parents and daughter by talking to Ellen's parents, as they seemed to like me. Although it was clear that she had no interest in helping them, she said she would leave because she didn't want any trouble with the police, especially after everything that had happened, but she wanted me to know that the cervical cancer thing was true and that they had really believed that by coming back they could make peace with all of us, but clearly we are not willing to do that. He said Ellen hadn't mentioned anything about this when she visited her parents because she didn't want to worry them too much, but now he thought they wouldn't mind anyway. He asked me to tell him as a last favor. If he didn't even want to do that, he would accept it and in a week they would come home and never bother us again. He left without me having to call the police and, honestly, now I don't know what to do. I felt like I needed to get it off my chest and I guess I'll have to decide whether or not to tell Ellen's parents what they said to me. I guess I'll have to do it eventually anyway, so we'll see what happens. Update 4, it's the end of the week and, if Ellen and Scott kept their word about leaving, they've probably gone home by now. After my last conversation with Scott, there were no further attempts to contact her and I did speak to Ellen's parents about everything they told me. I told them about cervical cancer and, although they seemed very affected and sad about it, they said they weren't going to contact her, at least not for now. They care more about their granddaughter than they do about her, and maybe in the future they would reconsider, but for now it's too recent and painful to think about. Besides, we only have Scott's word as proof and, while I don't want to minimize the experience of any cancer survivor, my opinion of them isn't good enough to believe that they wouldn't use something like this to get my sympathy and get me to contact them again. So now we're back to our normal lives with one exception, my parents still won't talk to me, but I guess I'll get used to it. Fortunately, I talked about all this with some friends and they were all supportive. They were very angry with my parents for their reaction and said I was right to cut off communication with them, so I won't worry about anyone else anymore. I will just focus on my mental health and try to repair all the damage that has been done in the last few weeks.